Hi everybody, welcome back. So today I'd like to talk with you about plant hardiness zones. Sometimes they're also called climate zones. And I want to talk with you about 3 potential limitations to keep in mind when you use them to help guide you to decide on what plants you're going to put in your garden. So I'm going to use as an example the United States Department of Agriculture hardiness zones, and that's just because, I'm from the United States, so that's what I'm familiar with. But I really don't want this video to be just for US viewers. What I'd like for you all to see this as more of a tutorial on how to think critically about these types of zones and how to consider the nuances of your specific climate and its effects in your garden as you choose which plants you want to grow. Then what I hope is that you'll be able to apply a similar thought process, kind of, as what I'm using today, and apply that to whatever hardiness or climate zones are used in your region of the world. So first, I want to describe to you what the USDA hardiness zones are, just in case you happen to not be familiar with them. So the US is basically divided geographically into a number of zones based on the average annual minimum temperature in the winter. And this is a 30-year running average. And these zones are basically broken up into 10-degree Fahrenheit chunks. So that would be 5.6 degrees Celsius chunks. And then each chunk or increment is further divided up into kind of 2 sub-chunks. So, and into 5-degree increments. So that's 5 degrees Fahrenheit or 2.8 degrees Celsius. So for example, I'm in zone 9, and zone 9 is broken up into zone 9A and 9B. So the goal behind these zones is to help people know what plants can survive in their region. And usually this is most applicable when you're thinking about planting perennials. And perennials are plants that live for multiple years. So what that means is they have to survive whatever type of winter that you have. And so it's good to know what that average minimum temperature is. The zones are somewhat less applicable to annuals, and annuals are plants that complete their life cycle within a single year because they're typically grown during the warmer season. So typically in most places, the spring and the summer and fall. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, such as where I live, where it's warm enough that we can grow annuals all year long. So let's start talking about some potential limitations to consider when you're using hardiness or climate zones to help guide you in your own garden. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about 3 today. So the first limitation I want to talk about, it has to do with using just one metric to define a zone. So for example, the USDA hardiness zones are only defined by one thing, and that is basically how cold it gets in your area. And this is common for hardiness or climate zones around the world, which are typically based on just one metric, although certainly not exclusively so. So one example is, I believe in the UK, the Royal Horticultural Society uses the absolute minimum temperature in the winter, which is different from the average minimum like we use in the United States, but it's still just one metric, and specifically temperature. So one of the limitations with this is it doesn't take into account how often you reach those low temperatures, and when you do, how long do you stay there at that low temperature? So let me give you an example based on where I live. So I'm in USDA zone 9B. And so what that means is that the average minimum winter temperature that we would see would be between 25 and 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about -4 to -1 degrees Celsius. So this is below freezing. These are cold enough temperatures to kill plants that are frost tender. However, I grow tomatoes in the winter in my yard. I grow mangoes. I grow guavas. I grow avocados that are more frost tender varieties. So what gives? If you just look at my zone, you would think, no way could you grow those things in the winter here, but yet I'm doing it. Well, part of that is that we rarely reach those temperatures. And when we do, we don't stay there long. So reaching a temperature below 30 degrees or below about 1 degree Celsius, it happens here maybe 1 to 3 times a year, if that. And when it does happen, we only stay at those temperatures maybe an hour or two right around dawn. And then the sun comes up, shines right on those cold plants and warms them up. So we really don't need to worry about those temperatures. Every once in a while, if the forecast suggests it's going to be extremely cold and I have some vulnerable plants, I'll go out and cover them up with a frost blanket. But there are many years I don't have to do that at all. So again, you want to think about in your own garden, if you're using some sort of hardiness zone, if it has anything to do maybe with minimum temperature, also think about how often does your yard even get that temperature? How long does it stay that way? And that can tell you kind of where you can push the boundaries like I do, such as growing tomatoes in the winter. A second limitation, which is really related to the first, has to do with not taking other important climate factors into account. So for example, if you're only looking at temperature, then you're not considering other things that affect the growth of plants. So examples could be the length of the growing season, the timing and the amount of rainfall you receive, summer highs instead of just winter lows, wind patterns, level of humidity. All these things are important for plant growth, but they are not included in, for example, the USDA hardiness zones. And so what this can mean is that two locations in the same hardiness zone can have completely different climates, which of course is going to affect what you can grow well. So once again, I want to give you an example from where I live. So I live in what is officially known as a hot summer Mediterranean climate. We're bounded by the ocean and mountains and by the desert, and we're in just the very upper edge of the subtropics at 34 degrees latitude. So what does this mean? What kind of climate do we have? So first of all, we have very hot, very dry summers. Our summer temperatures are close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's about 38 degrees Celsius for several months out of the year. We have very low humidity. It can be in the single digits, below 10%, quite regularly. And we have no measurable rainfall, typically for 6 to 8 months out of the year, and sometimes longer. And we're often in that, that's a normal drought every summer, but we're often in large scale droughts as well. So that's the summer. We have cool, wet winters. So by cool, I don't mean cold. They're not cold at all. We're typically in the 60s and 70s, which is about 18 to 25 degrees Celsius. If it's going to be outside that range, it's usually going to be hotter than that. And this time of year, winter, this is when we get our rainfall. We get about 14 inches of rainfall, or about 350 millimeters, which, as many of you know, is not a lot, and we're only getting it in a very limited time window in the year. And as I mentioned, even then, we're in drought frequently. I've lived here most of my life and feels like we're always in and out of drought at one point or another. So that's our climate, zone 9B. So if you take a little mental trip with me and go 3,000 miles east to the other side of our country, we can talk about Orlando, Florida. Those of you may know that's where Disney World is. So Orlando, Florida is the exact same plant hardiness zone. It is 9B. But the climate is completely different. It's true, they're still subtropical, they're even farther south than us, but they get, for example, 53 inches of rain a year on average. That's 1,350 millimeters, or about almost 4 times as much rain as I get where I live. And that rain is distributed differently. So I get most of my rain in the winter, almost all of it. Their rain is distributed throughout the entire year, but it looks a bit heavier in the summer. The other thing is, it's very humid there. I've been to Orlando, maybe some of you have. It's often like being in a swamp. It's surprising that you can't see the water in the air. It can feel so thick. So it's very different. The other thing is it's hot there, but it doesn't get quite as hot as it does here. And the temperatures look more stable across the year and even between night and day. So as you can see, we're both in 9B. We both have the same average minimum temperature, but our climates are wildly different. And so, of course, that's going to affect what we can grow well. A third limitation with these hardiness or climate zones has to do with how applicable they are to the regions they're supposed to apply to. So again, let me give you an example from the United States. So the USDA hardiness zones that we've been talking about function quite well. They are quite accurate for the eastern 2/3 of the country. But their accuracy basically completely breaks down for the western part of the country. And there are multiple reasons for that. But the biggest reasons are the fact that the western third of the United States is very mountainous. And then we also have the influence of the Pacific Ocean. And those two things interact to create a wide variety of microclimates. So these USDA zones are just not really as helpful in our part of the world, including California. So that means that large portions of California are mostly in zones 9 and 10, although it's, lower zones in the mountains. But we have very different climates, very different temperature ranges. So again, I'll give you another example, and this will be based mainly on temperature, but of course there are other climate differences as well. So if you watch the news in California and you watch the weather report, what you're going to see are a minimum of 4 forecasts. So they will give you forecasts for the coast, for the inland valleys, for the mountains, and for the deserts. And even that is an oversimplification. So there are many more microclimates than that, but you don't just have one single forecast for the state. And it's really quite normal in the summer for it to be in the 60s, so between 16 and 21 Celsius, and cloudy at the coast, and to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit here or 38 degrees Celsius and hot, like sunny at my house. And the ocean is 55 miles or 88 kilometers from my house. So technically I could drive there in under an hour. And throughout most of the summer, there's a 30 to 40 degree Fahrenheit difference between our regions. I'm zone 9B, the coast is zone 10A. They don't get quite as cold, but that's a huge difference. And it's because the USDA hardiness zones aren't really that applicable to where I'm living. Now, I will tell you that to mitigate this problem, we do have in the United States something called the sunset climate zones, and they're for the western United States. And if you're interested, I can do another video on those. But basically, that's a system of 24 zones that take a lot more than just temperature into account, and they're more accurate for our specific region. So that's thinking about larger regional applicability. But I also want you to think about how these zones apply or not to the conditions in, say, your specific yard, your garden. And so you have to think about what we call microclimates. And microclimates can be at different levels. So microclimate could be your city, but it could also be your garden. And so, I'm in the northern hemisphere, which means that the north side of my house is always going to be the coolest and shadiest side of the house. And so that's one thing to keep in mind is, which side of your yard is cooler, which side of your yard is warmer. And the other thing about my yard is most of it, where the vegetable garden and the orchard are, they're on a very, very sunny, exposed, southwestern facing slope, which again, in the northern hemisphere, that's where they're going to get baked all day long. And so what ends up happening is that my yard is 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. It's about 2.8 to 5.6 Celsius warmer than what you're going to see if you look online to see, what's the temperature in my town right now? So, for example, if it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 Celsius on the news, that's what they're saying, in my yard, it's going to be closer to 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 Celsius. So that's a pretty huge deal. So that has implications for what I can grow. So I have to actually put up shade cloth one of these days. I'll show you all, but my husband and I built a metal structure over the entire vegetable garden so that we could easily put up shade cloth. And it's up for 4 months out of the year during the summer. because suppose it's summer and heat-loving plants can't survive the heat where I live. And part of that is I just live in a hot climate, and part of that is that my yard is so much hotter than. And also, we're talking about heat. This has nothing to do with average minimum temperature, right? So once again, what I'd like for you to think about is, how are these climate zones applicable to you? What's different about what your yard, and how is it different? Because that is going to influence what kind of plants that you can grow. And I'll give another example about that in just a minute. So those are the three limitations that I'd like you to think about as you consider what to put in your garden. And I want to be clear to you all that I'm not opposed to these zones or using them. I don't think they're bad. I don't think they're wrong. I actually do think they provide useful information. They do help people, and I myself refer to them as well. It's just that, any general system that's meant to operate on a very large scale is by its very nature going to lack nuance, right? It's going to lack that detail at the level of your immediate region, your immediate garden. And that's just to be expected. And I think it's something that's really important to keep in mind, because then if you consider the specific characteristics of your growing space, that's going to enable you to be a more successful gardener. So I'll give you one last example. It's just kind of been the ongoing bane of my existence, but I'm getting better, and that's tomatoes. So as I've mentioned, I live in zone 9B. That on the surface level would tell me you can't grow tomatoes in the winter here, supposedly, and that they should do quite well in the summer here. And I spent a long time really struggling with tomatoes. It just didn't make sense to me why they weren't doing well. They're supposed to love heat. So a part of it was that I grew up about 100 miles or 160 kilometers northwest of here, in a very different climate, even though it's very close to me. And we had much colder winters, even though it was still the same zone. And so we couldn't grow tomatoes in the winter, but we had beautiful, warm, mild, long summers. It was hot enough to make tomatoes happy, but not so hot as to kill them. And so we could start them in March, and we'd be eating tomatoes through November. We could grow indeterminate tomatoes really well. So those are the kind that just keep growing and producing basically till frost kills them. And so I just have repeated tomatoes throughout the summer. And I moved here, and it's the same zone, and I'm thinking, well, I can do things the same way. And I would get my tomatoes started in March and, look great, be doing really, really well. I get a first round of tomatoes, maybe June, July, which is summer in my region. And then they were toast. No more tomatoes. The plants would look terrible. It was just the end. And so then I had to start learning, like, what's different? What's the problem? Am I just a bad gardener? What is it? And I was like, no, I started learning from other southern gardeners that it's simply too hot here. But it's not too cold in the winter. I do grow special varieties in the winter, so ones that can tolerate, colder nights, etc. So I learned I can grow indeterminate tomatoes fall, winter, spring, and then in the summer, spring into summer, I can grow indeterminate tomatoes, but they're going to be toast by midsummer, sometimes before. And so then I'm actually starting to move towards more determinate varieties. So those are varieties that grow and produce all within a well-defined time period. They kind of produce all at once and then they're done. And I think that's easier because they're going to be done anyways once the heat comes. And so now I'm starting to have success with tomatoes because I'm changing what I'm doing based on the nuances, not just of my climate, but also of my particularly boiling yard in the summer. So in any case, I hope that these thoughts and these examples have given you something useful to think about as you plan your own garden. Let me know in the comments what hardiness or climate zones you use in your region of the world and whether you find them helpful. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.